It was an unusually sunny afternoon in downtown Crest Hill, a gentrified neighborhood known for its boutique stores, trendy cafes, and heavy police presence. Amara Johnson, a poised and accomplished black woman in her early 40s, walked out of Maison Etoile, one of the city's most exclusive fashion houses. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit and red heels, Amara carried a few high-end shopping bags and spoke casually on her phone, smiling as she recounted her shopping success. To her sister, Amara, the wife of Police Chief Marcus Johnson, was well known in her own right. A civil rights attorney and community leader, she had spent years fighting discrimination in law enforcement and lobbying for policy reform. However, on this day, she wasn't in court or giving speeches. She was simply enjoying a quiet afternoon. Off-dot as she walked toward her parked black Tesla, a white police cruiser suddenly screeched to a halt beside her. The door flung open, and out stepped Officer Brent Malloy, a stocky man in his late 30s with a reputation for aggressive stops, especially in affluent neighborhoods where he believed certain people didn't belong. "Ma'am," he barked, already approaching with a hand on his belt. "I need to speak with you. I've received reports of suspicious activity." "Step away from the vehicle." Amara turned, eyebrows raised in confusion. "Excuse me? Suspicious activity? I just left the store. You can ask the clerks." "I said, step away from the vehicle," Malloy repeated more forcefully. He glanced at the shopping bags. "What's in those?" "My personal belongings, purchased legally," she replied firmly. "I have the receipts, if that's what you need." But the officer wasn't interested in her explanation. His gaze lingered on her skin, her confidence, her presence. All of it seemed to provoke him. He took a step closer, now inches from her. "You're acting defensive. That tells me you have something to hide." Amara blinked, stunned. "I'm asserting my rights, officer. I've done nothing wrong. If you suspect otherwise, I suggest you." Before she could finish, he grabbed her wrist, attempting to pull the bags from her hand. She recoiled instinctively, which he took as resistance. "That's it," he snapped, twisting her arm behind her back and pushing her roughly against the side of the car. Crowds began to gather as Amara's phone clattered to the pavement, still connected to her husband, Chief Marcus Johnson. The conversation abruptly turned from laughter to chaos, with the sound of Amara's voice becoming strained. "Let go of me. I can't breathe." She gasped as Malloy wrapped his arm around her neck and forced her to the ground in a chokehold. Someone in the crowd yelled, "She didn't do anything. She showed him the receipt." Another bystander started recording, while others shouted for Malloy to stop. Still, the officer kept her pinned, panting like a predator cornering prey. It wasn't about law enforcement anymore. It was about dominance, and he was lost in it. On the cracked screen of her phone, Chief Johnson could hear it all, the crowd, the gasps, the unmistakable choke in his wife's voice. His heart stopped. And then it erupted with fury. He didn't hang up. He didn't hesitate. He went straight into action. Within 10 minutes, the city would see exactly what happened when injustice tried to crush the wrong woman, and her husband was the one who ran the entire police department. The grip around Amara Johnson's neck tightened, cutting off not just her airflow but also her dignity, her sense of safety, and her belief that her rights could protect her. It was a surreal moment. A woman who had spent her life defending others in court now found herself being brutalized in broad daylight on a public sidewalk. Officer Brent Malloy showed no restraint, no hesitation. His face was a mask of cold aggression, as if he'd stopped seeing her as a human being the moment he approached. To him, Amara's refusal to cower, her calm explanation, her request for boundaries, was defiance. And defiance from a black woman, in his mind, could only be met with force. Amara struggled, but not to escape. She knew better than to resist physically. She wasn't trying to fight him off. She was simply trying to breathe. Her heels had snapped, her hair was coming undone, and one of her shopping bags had burst open, spilling a designer purse and receipts onto the concrete. But all of that faded into the background. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Her limbs were growing numb. She couldn't speak. Her vision blurred. The crowd was shouting now, growing louder and angrier. "She can't breathe," someone cried. "Let her go, man. You're going to kill her." Another bystander, a young black man in his 20s, stepped forward, fists clenched. "Get off her." Malloy instinctively reached for his holster. Glaring at the man, "Back up," he warned, though his knees still pressed into Amara's back. Meanwhile, across town, Chief Marcus Johnson had jumped into his unmarked police vehicle the moment he heard Amara's gasps through the phone. The call hadn't disconnected. He'd heard her voice weaken, heard her cry out for help, and he'd also heard the shouts of the bystanders. It didn't take a detective to understand what was happening. As he raced toward the location, his other hand was already dialing dispatch, barking orders. "Get me, I want internal affairs at 5th and Lenox now. I want a judge on standby. Have body cam footage uploaded immediately and secure civilian video. This is personal." Back at the scene, Amara's body finally went limp. Her lips were sear. Turning blue? The crowd had gone from shock to frantic. Malloy loosened his hold slightly, enough for her to gasp in a shuddering breath. "You're under arrest for resisting," he said harshly, even as she lay motionless. He yanked her up to her knees, preparing to cuff her. But that's when he heard it. Sirens, and not just one. Multiple. Unmarked vehicles, a legal team. SUV and at least 3 internal affairs agents pulled up in seconds. Officers he didn't recognize were already stepping out with clipboards and body cameras running. Then he saw Marcus Johnson, police chief and decorated officer, stride into the crowd like a storm in human form. "Step away from her," Johnson sighed, his voice ice-cold and deliberate. Malloy blinked, stunned. "Sir, I was just—" "You were choking my wife," Johnson interrupted. "In front of witnesses. In violation of every protocol you swore to uphold." The scene had shifted. Malloy's authority was gone. The moment he touched Amara, he stopped being a cop and became the criminal. And the next stop wasn't the station. It was court. In the quiet office at police headquarters, Chief Marcus Johnson had just wrapped up a strategy call with city officials regarding community policing reforms. It had been a long, frustrating morning balancing budgets, managing personnel disputes, and pushing for changes in a system that seemed to resist progress at every turn. He had looked forward to a short break, especially after his wife Amara told him she'd be out enjoying the day, finally indulging herself with a shopping trip, something she rarely took time to do. When his phone buzzed with her name, he answered with a smile, but that smile disappeared in seconds. What should have been light chatter about handbags and window displays quickly turned into confusion on his end. He heard a man's voice, aggressive, accusatory. Amara's tone changed. She was still composed, but there was tension in her voice as she tried to explain, tried to de-escalate. Then came the unmistakable shift. Her voice tightened, then cracked. Raised voices in the background. The thud of something hitting the ground. Then came the words that burned into Marcus's soul. "I can't breathe." He froze. Time slowed. "What?" Followed was chaos through the speaker. Bystanders shouting. Someone yelling for the officer to stop. And the awful sound of Amara choking. Marcus didn't hang up. He didn't even say goodbye. He was already out of his chair and moving. His mind calculating every move with sharp precision. Years in law enforcement had trained him to act fast in a crisis, but this wasn't just a crisis. This was his wife. The woman he had built a life with, protected, loved, and watched fight for others now needed him to fight for her, immediately. He didn't call the officer. He didn't try to reason with anyone. He called Internal Affairs. "This is Chief Johnson. We have a live officer misconduct emergency in progress. I need eyes on Officer Brent Malloy at 5th and Lenox. Deploy EA and notify the Civilian Review Unit. I also want every available cruiser rerouted to the scene as backup for containment. And get me Judge Rutherford. We may need an emergency hearing within the hour." He hung up without waiting. For confirmation, they would follow orders. They always did when he used that tone. The tone he reserved for when policies had been broken, reputations were on the line, or blood had been spilled. Driving like a man possessed, Johnson cut through traffic lights, his badge flashing on the dashboard. Every second was torture. He clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, 1,000 scenarios racing through his mind, all of them worse than the last dot as he neared the scene. He could already see a growing crowd, the flashing lights of early responders. And then, in the distance, a shape on the pavement. Amara. He parked with a jolt, not even bothering to shut off the engine. Officers turned as he stepped out, not in a rush, not with theatrics, but with the authority of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. His badge wasn't just symbolic. It was about to become a weapon of accountability. The call had been accidental, but its timing? Inevitable. Officer Malloy had just attacked the wrong woman. And now, he'd face the full force of the man on the other end of the line. The air around 5th and Lenox was electric, thick with tension, camera flashes, and the rising sound of a community watching justice turn on its heel. The crowd had grown. What began as a handful of concerned bystanders was now a swelling group of angry citizens, news reporters and off-duty civil rights activists, who had heard about the incident through social media posts that were already going viral. In the center of it all stood Officer Brent Malloy, still trying to maintain control of the scene, though the balance of power was shifting quickly. He looked around, confused, as unfamiliar faces in suits and plainclothes began approaching with clipboards, badges, and neutral expressions. They weren't there to support him. They were there to investigate him. When Chief Marcus Johnson stepped into the crowd, a hush fell. The man was known citywide, not just as a high-ranking official, but as one of the most respected law enforcement professionals in the region. He had built his reputation on discipline, honor, and a fierce commitment to rooting out racism within the department. But no one had ever seen him like this. His uniform was crisp, his face hard as stone. His eyes locked on Officer Malloy, who had instinctively backed away from Amara, now sitting on the curb, dazed but conscious, cradled by a female medic. Malloy stammered as Johnson approached. "Chief, I didn't know she was your—" Johnson cut him off. "She's a citizen. That's all you ever needed to know." Malloy tried to explain, but the chief raised a hand. "Don't speak. This is no longer your scene." He turned to the arriving internal affairs officers. "You have my full cooperation. Retrieve body cam footage. Collect bystander videos. Get statements. Secure the chokehold timestamp and document every second from the moment he engaged." Amara's phone, which had recorded the assault through the open call, was already in the hands of the legal team Johnson had summoned on his way. A tech specialist downloaded the audio for use in court. The city attorney's office had also sent a representative as per Johnson's urgent request. The entire machinery of justice had been spun into motion with precision and fury. Reporters began shouting questions. "Chief, will Officer Malloy be placed on leave? Will charges be filed today? Is it true the victim is your wife?" Johnson didn't stop walking. "He's being detained. The court will decide what happens next." But let me be clear, brutality is brutality, badge or not. And this department will not cover for predators in uniform. As the cameras rolled, Malloy was handcuffed by Internal Affairs. It was a shocking image, a white officer being arrested on the spot in public for assaulting a black woman. It wasn't just unusual, it was historic that the footage had already spread to local news networks and was climbing to national attention. Activists were preparing statements. Protests were already being planned, not in outrage, but in solidarity with the kind of swift, visible justice the community rarely got to see. For once, the system wasn't protecting the abuser, it was protecting the truth, and Officer Malloy wasn't going home. He was going straight to court. By the time Officer Brent Malloy was transported to the courthouse, the world outside had already exploded with outrage and disbelief. Social media was flooded with footage from multiple angles. The chokehold, Amara's gasps, the crowd's desperate pleas. News outlets had dubbed the incident the Lennox attack. What made the story even more explosive was the revelation that the victim, Amara Johnson, wasn't just an innocent woman. She was the wife of the police chief and a renowned civil rights attorney. The courthouse was packed within the hour. The judge, Honorable Ruth McMillan, agreed to an emergency hearing, recognizing the extraordinary nature of the case. Cameras were allowed in for the opening statements, and crowds gathered outside with signs that read, "Protect Black Women," "Justice for Amara," and "Fire Malloy now." Inside the courtroom, Chief Marcus Johnson sat beside his wife, his jaw clenched, his uniform pristine. Amara, though still bruised and emotionally shaken, had her posture straight and her expression firm. She had lived through humiliation and violence, but she would not let it define her. Malloy sat at the defense table, suddenly much smaller than he'd appeared on the street. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued legal strategist named Grant Whitlow, tried to seize the narrative early. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case isn't about race or reputation. It's about a routine stop gone wrong. My client perceived a threat. His reaction, however severe, was grounded in instinct, not malice. The prosecution wasn't having it. They opened with the audio from Amara's phone call, the gasping, the crowd shouting, 'She can't breathe,' and Officer Malloy yelling over it all. Next came a video montage from 3 witnesses, synced to a precise timeline showing how quickly Malloy escalated, from first contact to chokehold, in less than 90 seconds. Then came the body cam. Footage. It didn't show a threat. It showed a woman calmly asserting her rights, displaying receipts, and asking questions. It showed a man growing hostile, pushing her, ignoring protocol. The footage was damning. And this time, there was no blue wall to hide behind. The judge's face remained neutral throughout the playback, but her eyes narrowed as the timeline became clear. Then, in a moment that silenced the room, Chief Johnson took the stand in uniform. Under oath, with the eyes of the nation on him, he delivered testimony that was both clinical and deeply personal. What Officer Malloy did, he said, was not policing. It was prejudice. He didn't see a woman. He didn't see a citizen. He saw a black body he thought he could control. He didn't know she was my wife, and that's not the point. What if she wasn't? What if it had been someone else's daughter, mother, wife? He should be held accountable, not because of who she is to me, but because of what he did to her as a human being. A hush followed his words. Even the judge seemed momentarily shaken by the depth of his restraint and clarity. The courtroom was no longer just a place for legal proceedings, it was the epicenter of a national reckoning. A space where justice, long denied to many, finally had a voice that couldn't be ignored. And Officer Malloy was no longer the accuser. He was the accused. The courtroom's final verdict was swift and thunderous. Officer Brent Malloy was found guilty of assault, use of excessive force and civil rights violations. The judge ordered his immediate termination from the police force, and criminal charges would proceed with sentencing in the coming weeks. The bail was denied due to overwhelming video evidence, the risk of public unrest, and the serious nature of the crime. Cheers erupted from the crowd gathered outside the courthouse. The chants of justice for Amara echoed through the city streets. For once, the justice system had not only acted, it had acted fast, decisively, and publicly. People who had long lost faith in accountability watched in stunned awe as the system turned on one of its own in defense of a black woman's life. Inside the courtroom, Amara Johnson sat quietly, her hand resting in her husband's. She was still recovering, not just from the physical trauma, but from the emotional weight of being humiliated and nearly killed in public simply for existing. But through the pain, there was resolve in her eyes. She stood before the press outside the courthouse later that evening, delivering a calm but powerful statement. "What happened to me," she said, "was not unique. What made it unusual was who I was married to. That reality should make us all uncomfortable. Because justice shouldn't depend on who you know or who you belong to. It should be the right of every citizen, black, white, rich, poor, to walk down the street and feel safe. And when that right is violated, the system should rise up to defend them." Her words resonated like a shockwave. Civil rights organizations across the country picked up the story, holding it as a model for rapid, transparent accountability. Police reform advocates used it to reignite pressure on lawmakers. Cities that had grown weary of endless reports with no action now had an example of what swift justice could look like, and how leadership at the top could make all the difference. But the impact didn't end there. Within a month, Chief Marcus Johnson announced a sweeping internal audit of the Crest Hill Police Department. Officers with prior complaints of excessive force were reevaluated. Training protocols were overhauled. Community leaders were brought into the oversight process. A new public dashboard was created to track all use of force incidents in real time, and most significantly, Amara launched the Justice Without Bias Foundation, an organization dedicated to protecting marginalized citizens from police abuse and ensuring victims had immediate legal support. The foundation offered a 24/7 legal response team, trained in civil rights law, ready to deploy in cases of police misconduct, a direct result of how her husband was able to act so quickly to save her. She turned her pain into policy, her trauma into transformation. Officer Malloy would go to prison. That part was certain. But more importantly, his actions had sparked a reckoning far greater than he ever imagined. The badge he had used to assert power would now serve as a symbol of what could happen when those in power were held accountable. And in the end, Amara Johnson, once a victim, had become the face of reform, not just in her city, but across the nation.